Hello, welcome, 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 welcome. Oh my goodness. Well, I ran this thing through the snow, this really wet, super heavy, deep snow. And with these tire chains, it was like total beast mode. The thing was nuts. It did not get stuck at all, which is like amazing. So I'm going to put them in the front too. It's actually really easy. Just find the right size O-ring and chain. The only thing you really want to watch out for is to make sure that they're not going to rub on the axles, which they're really close, but you don't want that because it'll just being this, everything's plastic, it'll rub through there in about 2 seconds. So my first, I ran out of the right size O-rings, so I homemade some, but they were a little too small, so I just made some more. It's a beautiful thing being able to make your own O-rings. But anyway, I'll show you how I make these little things. It's almost like making your own chainmail in a way. Just need some good pliers. Have to disconnect the mic and plug in the charger, damn it. Having some trouble with microphones here. There are like 7 of them that aren't working. Nothing new there.
We've got passion, we've got determination. Like, and if we set our sights on something, you better believe it's happening. We always felt like our content was all about entertainment, being fun, but there was also this professional business side. One of the things that we knew was basically essential was getting our own website, so people would actually see a proper official group who mean business and who can deliver. And we always had this vision of bringing things into existence that previously not been seen.
This is the world's largest act!
We bounced a plane, a boat and a car, and like, it was wild. So today, how ridiculous, have 50 million followers? We're in the billions of tens of billions. That's pretty good. I don't know all the things that we're going to get to do in the next year or 5 years, but if we can do this as a job, anything's possible. Do you know what's really fun? Making a website on webs. What's happening?
It's hardcore history. Addendum. So I am a Davy Jones fan, and many of you are too, no doubt. He's one of our finest writers of history for the period of the Middle Ages, the fall of Rome to the Renaissance. A lot of stuff that made up what a lot of us grew up with loving. I mean, you've got knights in shining armor, crusades, Normans, Saxons. I mean, this is pretty par for the course for a lot of history fans, and if that's your jam, then you need to pick up Dan Jones's new book, Powers and Thrones. He's with us today to talk about it. But you probably already read his stuff. The Plantagenets was great. the Wars of the Roses, Crusaders, the Templars, Magna Carta. The book covers the entire period from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance in the European, Middle Eastern, North African sort of zone. 656 pages. I looked it up, covering 1,000 years. That's audacious, isn't it? But just like there's a lot of interesting stuff you could glean from a very narrowly focused, targeted work on a small chunk of history, so you can really delve into it, turn over every stone, examine it to the nth degree. There are advantages to doing the opposite. You get a much larger sense of how cultures are working together and pinging off each other, a larger sense of trends impacting over time, right? They all have their place. And Jones's book is one of those that, if you actually retained what's in it, it would fill in your foundational knowledge base for a huge chunk of time and a large, important region, geographically speaking. It's a page turner. There's a lot of historical figures that we've all fallen in love with that fall into a book like this. What I love about it, though, is at the same time that it's comforting, if you've always been interested in this stuff, to read this book, it's comforting for me anyway. He's got all the new stuff, right? All the new discoveries, all the clarifications, all the overturned myths. We've talked before about how interesting it is now that the area of historical knowledge is aided not just by historians and archaeologists, the people that have always sort of had that as their purview, but tons of other scientific disciplines that, working with these people, are making the kinds of discoveries and datings possible that we never could have imagined. I mean, just the other day there was a story, and you may have seen it, confirming certainly many of us had already known that the Vikings had arrived in the Americas, but coming up with a pretty solid date for it. And they said 1021, 1021 AD CE. And when you read the story of how they came up with the date, the radiologists that are involved, the climatologists that are involved, I mean, it is so many experts from so many varied fields working together to get us this information. Anyway, it's fascinating. It's a part of what makes the modern historical study so interesting to people, who've been reading the books forever, but all of a sudden you have new stuff on old stories, right? Who doesn't love that? And Powers and Thrones has a bunch of those where you're going, oh, really? So this major invasion happened because of a climate change that they can now prove was going on. I mean, it's that kind of thing. So I loved it. I think you'll enjoy it too if you're a Indiana Jones fan. I don't have to tell you what he writes are sort of page turners in terms of being able to pick out really interesting things. It's fabulous, and so is he. He's on the show today. And so without further ado, and I hope you like this, but I'm just sort of fanboying out. It's more for me than for you. But you guys pay the bills around here, so I'll let you listen in. Dan Jones, ladies and gentlemen. The first thing I want to say is that this book, I think I tried to describe it once as comfort food for a history fan like yours truly, because I grew up reading stuff like this. But what I love about your book is it incorporates all these favorite topics of mine with all the latest stuff, right? The latest evidence and theories. I mean, I remember, for example, when you got to the part about the famous arrival of the Huns into the Roman world, and you threw the climate element in there and talked about, is it called a Chilean juniper plant or whatever that they used for climate dating? I was absolutely enthralled. So to start off, I mean, there's a lot of people that think that history is sort of a set thing, and because once you know what happens, nothing changes. But talk to me about, like I said, a guy, yours truly, I was reading this stuff at 14 years old, 13, 12, and there's so much new stuff in a story that I thought I knew. That's pretty normal, though, isn't it? I mean, we're always updating stuff, aren't we?
Well, firstly, I mean, thank you for those kind comments, and I'm glad the book reminded you of those classic histories that you like to read, because I like to read those histories too, and I wanted to create a book that had that feel, like you want to turn the pages, like I could give this to an intelligent 13-year-old and get them like buzzed on medieval history. But if we're talking about, I suppose we're going pretty deep here early on, like what is history? And history is a dialogue, I think, between the past and present. Although in a book like I've just written, it's narrative, it's chronological, it starts at the beginning of the Middle Ages and follows the story through to the end. There's always new research going on in lots of different areas. There's always, and even more than that, every generation has its own preoccupations, which it seeks to somehow see reflected or see the foundations of them in the past. So that's why we can write new histories on, be it the Tudor dynasty, the Plantagenet dynasty, the Second World War, the Mongol conquest or whatever, each generation, because there's always new research to draw on. But even more than that, there's new societal preoccupations to reflect.
So much
You know,
bigger.
one of those classic
Looks like
books
I'm gonna
that
drop a link.
that you've referenced, I don't know, I mean, tell me if you enjoyed this book as well when you were growing up, was Barbara Tuchman's The Distant Mirror, right?
Oh, sure. Have it up in the bookshelf. Yeah, I can see it from here.
I mean, that's a great book. That's a book that takes the calamitous 14th century. It's written in, I think, 1974, and uses the 14th century as the title suggests, a distant mirror on the 20th. Another time of war and of instability in Europe and plague and social turmoil. And when I started writing Powers and Thrones, I set out to write this history of the Middle Ages. I thought, how do we do that for the 21st century? How do we look at the Middle Ages with a sense of what matters to us today, and thereby create a form of empathy in the mind of the reader? And so when I tackled the Middle Ages, I was looking for things that I actually had a list of things I thought were going to be important, were already important, going to become more important as the first half of the 21st century went on. And that list was climate change, mass migration, pandemic disease, technological change, and global networks. So as I was putting together this new history of the Middle Ages, I didn't seek to just only look at those things, but I thought if we can lift those out of the research, lift those out of the storytelling, then this will make the Middle Ages somehow seem approachable to this, be it an intelligent 13-year-old reading history for the first time, or someone of our kind of generation reading history for the 15th time. That's the big philosophy of what I've been doing. Anyway.
There's a line I like from an Ohio State University historian named Robert C. Davis, who says, history is, often as not, our present politics projected onto the past. And that makes it sound artificial, but the way I look at it is like when I'm reading your book and you're referencing climate change, tipping off certain major historical events. I recall that when I was younger, they still talked about climate change doing this, but because we understand and are living through more climate change than we were when I was younger, I think we get it better, if that makes sense. Look, you had talked about like globalized networks. Well, you understood that in 1982 also, but boy, you understand it so much better now when we live in it and it's so in your face. So I think that's just reflective of a better understanding that we have of how those things go now in our world, and then it's easier to imagine how they might have impacted an earlier world.
Yeah, and I think that history, as you know, goes through like trends in terms of its kind of scholarly
fashion,
and some fashions, right? And sometimes every so often, someone will come along and say, you know what, history should be objective. It should be about truth-seeking and truth alone and the facts. Let's stick to the facts. And that will be fashionable for a little while, and then some bright spark will go, you know what, that you don't have to be a kind of French relativist philosopher to realize there is no objective truth. There's perspectives. The relativity defines how we think about the world. And so as a historian, as I've gotten older and a bit more confident, I suppose, I've stopped trying to shy away from this feeling or I've tried to avoid this feeling that we shouldn't project our own concerns into our study of the past, because otherwise, what's history for? History's like about creating a context for the now, and so it's not just inevitable, it's natural, and it's probably advisable that we take with us, or as long as we acknowledge them, we take with us our preconceptions, our prejudices, our concerns, our angst, our worries, when we go looking at the past. Otherwise, why be bothered? What are we going to learn? It's not there to give us context on the now.
Well, and I think sometimes if you're not looking for something, you don't find it, and sometimes you don't know you shouldn't be looking for it. And I think certain things like, I'll just reference the climate again, because to me, that was such an obvious. I mean, I remember as a kid hearing about the collapse of the Bronze Age, and climate was one of the things that they threw out there: drought, starvation, all those things. But I think when you look at our situation, say, well, what's our situation going to be like climate-wise in 100 years, 200 years? It helps sort of inform the listener to go back and go, well, gee, how bad can it get? And when was it bad? And how did they deal with it? How does an ancient society deal with some of the problems we're looking at? So, I mean, I find it it's funny, it's not just informative and useful as a comparative tool to me. There's a little bit of something that's comforting. I mean, if you've been through something before, it's a little less scary, even if you've never been through it quite this way. So let me talk, because you have to frame something like this, right? If you're going to start a story in the middle, as you do, right? The Middle Ages start in the middle. You have to have sort of a touchstone, right? And the touchstone is the obvious one. It's Rome, right? So you have a civilization that starts as a city-state around the time, the Persians are invading Greece, right? So the 500s, it's really, and then it goes through the Republican period, and then it goes through the Imperial period, and by the time the Middle Ages start, you have this ancient, and I mean, I try to think about our modern world now, which hasn't existed. If you say the modern world starts in the Renaissance, or, I mean, we haven't existed now as long as Rome was around as a civilization that could trace its roots back to something real. Explain a little bit on how this, on what happens to a world when a touchstone that's that concrete goes away.
So you're completely and utterly and 100% correct. Yeah, the framing of the Middle Ages has to be Rome. That's how. When the Middle Ages first was conceived in the 16th century, it was conceived as, by definition, the bit between the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West and the Reformation, and the sort of it's a Protestant idea, but the scales falling away from the eyes of the great enlightened new Christians of the 16th century. And you're also absolutely right to point to this longevity of Rome as compared to the longevity of our quote-unquote modern world. This can go back to the 16th century to date, the origins of that. What happens when an empire like that falls to bits, I think, is, in one sense, the answer is not very much, because it happens relatively slowly. Now, even though in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire there are cataclysmic events, the sack of Rome by Alaric and the Goths in 410 AD being the most obvious, it's not like the Western Roman Empire just falls to bits in one day. I suppose here's a not very encouraging dystopian read on the 21st century. Okay, if we were to hypothesize, and I personally hope this doesn't come to pass, but if we were to hypothesize that we're seeing the end of the end of the United States as a superpower, right? And we're some future historians writing from the 22nd century, we might look back on, say, 9/11 as a spectacular, assault on the heart of America that brought great chaos and tragic death and was horrifying and shocking around the world. But what we wouldn't say was, and at that moment, America ceased to be a superpower, would say that was some crazy. There were crazy repercussions to that one event, but to everybody who lived in the 20 years subsequently, it didn't really look like America collapsed. Okay, let's hope that's a dystopian sort of conjecture on my part, but I think you see what I'm saying. So I think if we project that idea back to the collapse of Rome, there were big moments such as, well, the Romans being sacked by Alaric and the Goths, or, I'm talking to you from the UK, Britannia being sort of jettisoned, like booted off into space from the Roman Empire. These, in retrospect, look like huge moments. But on the other hand, I think if you were living through it, there's just been a time of rising instability in different places and at different times, which over the course of several generations added up to the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But even if we think about the distance in time between 410 AD, sack of Rome, and 476, the last recognised Western Roman Empire. That's 66 years. Like, in terms of human lifespans of any age, that's quite a long time. So it's a, what am I looking? What's the analogy I'm looking for? It's a boiling of the frog, I suppose. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Crazy and abstract.
No, it makes sense. I always describe it as being cut off from the equivalent of the global information superhighway if you're Britain when Rome says you're on your own and whatnot. But as many historians have pointed out, if you're actually living in Italy at this time period, closer to where the center of Roman activity was, things continued differently. It's the hinterlands that feel it first and most strongly and recover the slowest. So let's talk a little about the recovery, because that's one of those periods that I don't think enough people, yours truly included, know enough about, and that's the Carolingian, the attempts to recreate something of Rome's grandeur from the ashes a couple centuries later. And they're connected to these people that, it's funny because the terminology will kill you when you start using terms like Franks to talk about a tribe that the Romans had dealt with, and you're still using Franks to describe Crusaders in the 1100s. Maybe talk about this, because it's almost like when you talk about the Roman ashes, the entities that begin to arise from the ashes, as you said, that you look at and say, they didn't know then that they're going to play a huge role. But we, looking back on it now, realize these Franks are going to be an important entity. Whatever those Franks are, who are the Franks?
Well, the Franks are originally one of many tribes who move into the territories that were ruled by the Western Roman Empire and ceased to be ruled by the Western Roman Empire as these barbarian tribes move, quote-unquote barbarian tribes move in. But you're absolutely right. Look, if we're placing bets in, let's say, the 6th or even the 7th century AD as to who's going to be around in 1,000 years? Is it the Franks? Is it the Burgundians? Is it the Lombards? Is it the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Suevi? There's all of these different tribal groups moving around what had been the Western Roman Empire, and at different times, not different of them were ascendant, but by the 8th, 9th century, the Franks, who traced in their own mythology, they said that they'd come a wandering from the Trojan Wars originally, but they'd come a wandering from Eastern Europe, probably, Germany, Central and Eastern Europe, across the Rhine into the broadly speaking area that we now call France, and had over several generations coalesced into a kingdom. Let's call it a kingdom. It was ruled by kings, first the Merovingians, the long-haired kings, which the king was connoted by growing his hair very long and could be deposed by having his hair cut off. And by and by, the Merovingian dynasty became less politically influential, governed, the Frankish territories were governed on their behalf by mayors of the palace, by politicians, and then they were done away with by a dynasty who we now call the Carolingians, named after Charles Martel, but most famous for producing Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, who had himself crowned in the year 800 as the first Roman emperor of the sort of reborn Western Roman Empire, which came to be the Holy Roman Empire. So we have a barbarian tribe which over many generations have become collectively a kingdom, and then they become, for a time, under Charlemagne and his descendants, the preeminent force in Western Europe.
The way they sort of absconded with the Roman reputation, title, and all that reminds me of one of those companies that has a great old lineage. Like in the United States, it might be like AT&T or something, and then AT&T goes out of business, but somebody buys the name, and then they get to be the new AT&T, and they get to inherit all that cachet, even though they had nothing to do with the original entity. For those who don't know, or maybe those in Germany right now, the name for France in Germany is still Frankreich, the Empire of the Franks. I also like, and I never made this connection when I was reading the Crusades from the Middle Eastern viewpoint. I forget what the book was called, and they referred to the Crusaders from Europe as the Franks. And I remember thinking, It just turns Frank into Frank right there, and then you begin to see the connections, because Frank doesn't mean anything to most people who speak the English language, but French obviously does. And when you see one word morph into the other, you kind of, the light bulb goes on in your head. You go, oh, okay, I see the connection. So this is interesting though also, because we did a show a long time ago on that transition periods of Merovingians to Carolingians, and when you read the accounts of what these Merovingian Franks were like, they sound like Vikings. When you look at pictures, and they're, the contemporary type stuff, but they're sort of I don't know if they're idealized or if we've barbarized the Merovingians in their true cut, but they all look so civilized and so King Arthur-like, and they look clean and washed and well dressed, and they look like they look very, very civilized. And then when you read the accounts of people like Charles Martel's a perfect example, but some of the Merovingian kings, what's the one who would have people bend over to bow for him, and then he'd split their skull with a battle axe? I mean, they had all these So let me ask you, I guess that's what I'm saying in my typically long-winded question, I am getting to somewhere, is that looking back on it with your eye, which of those two impressions of the Merovingians, the Franks before Charlemagne, and Pepin, his father, which of those two interpretations seems more like to you? Have we barbarized a bunch of people that were more civilized than we thought? Or have the chroniclers made a bunch of Viking types look better than they actually were?
I think, so much is what you want them to be. And I think particularly in the early Middle Ages, late antiquity, early Middle Ages, the evidence is so scant. I'm a late medievalist by inclination, by training. So when I came to writing this new book, a lot of the early Middle Ages was kind of virgin territory for me, and that was one of the reasons I enjoyed doing it. Of course, as always, you can be swayed very easily at first by the account that you're reading. Now, of course, if you're reading accounts of Romans watching the barbarians swarm over once solid Roman territories, they are barbarians. They're these sort of hideously uncivilized folk who have no right being where they are. But of course, as time goes by, and those hideously uncivilized folk who have no right being where they are become the ruling power, the chronicles become somewhat kinder to them. I'm a sucker for grave goods, Dan. And so if you take someone like Children the First, probably the first Merovingian king we know very much about at all.
You start finding all those bees in the grave goods, don't you?
Find the gold bees, and so we're talking about a guy who died at the end of the 5th century, around probably in 481. And in this ornamental gold bees, signet rings, spears, axes.
Lots of garnet everywhere. I love it.
Oh, garnet everywhere. You've made it when you got a bit of garnet on you. So look, obviously, here is a society that has a luxurious material culture accessible at least to the people at the very, very top of it. Here, probably, is also a society that, like most societies in human history, doesn't really offer very much for the ordinary Joe at the bottom of it, just sort of subsisting as best he, she, and family can do. So, I think it's totally a question of who you're looking at and from what perspective. Certainly, I think here's the thing about the Middle Ages in general, to sort of blow back into a big point. As the Middle Ages wear on, the evidence becomes fuller, and the people start to seem a little bit more like us, recognisable to a modern eye, and somewhat more sympathetic. So, for example, it's much easier for us to sympathise and empathise and feel some kind of fraternity with Leonardo da Vinci at the end of the Middle Ages, the universal genius and designing machines and dissecting bodies and painting great paintings, than it is for us even to put ourselves into the mind of Children the First with his lovely bees and garnets. Do you know what I mean? It just is easier because the time brings us closer to those people. So inevitably, I think when we look back very, very deep into the early Middle Ages, we can be somewhat appalled by the barbarity of the time.
You know, you make me think of something that I've always been fascinated with, and I don't know. I'd be very interested. Maybe this is a future book I need to work on or something. But I'm fascinated. So like when we look back at Leonardo da Vinci, like you just said, we understand that there has been tremendous amount of change, and we're comfortable with the idea that Leonardo would have dressed differently, looked differently, lived in a different sort of milieu than what we do, and that's understandable. But when you look at, for example, a portrayal, so you had mentioned the later Middle Ages, or the solid Middle Ages, let's just say the 14th century, right, 1300s. Somebody, you'll see manuscripts with them portraying a much earlier historical event, so maybe something from Rome, or maybe something from the Carolingians, or what have you, but they portray it in contemporary terms, right? So the people will be wearing the same sort of armor that they would be wearing in the 14th century, rather than armor that would have been, something more. In other words, we acknowledge that the things in Leonardo's time are not going to be like our own. They don't necessarily do that in the artwork. Did people, and this may not be a question that Dan Jones is the right person to ask, but do people back then, when they're talking about the kings of yore or whatever, do they understand that they're going to be living in a different sort of technological sort of situation, or is the assumption back then that everything is as everything was?
Well, this is a really good example, because we do the same thing today. So let's take let's drill down into the example you gave, and let's imagine a sort of 14th century French chronicle depicting the Song of Rome, probably the most famous story of the told in the later Middle Ages.
Right, in Spain or southern France, right.
He's on his way back from northern Spain, fighting the Saracens in northern Spain, and he's ambushed in Roncesvalles and blows the horn to summon to warn Charlemagne, the great king of the Franks, that there's trouble afoot. And in blowing the horn, his temples burst, and he dies a hero's death. Okay. The big story told in the 14th century, telling a heavily romanticized version of a story set in the late 8th century. So what is that? 14 minus 8, that's very good. 600 years previous. I just watched. And in that 14th century telling, you're right, the drawings will have in 14th century armour, and the mores of all the characters will essentially be 14th century. These will be 14th century people gadding about 600 years earlier. Now, I just watched Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, about the 14th century duel between two dudes over whether Adam Driver, the character Jacques Legree, had raped the wife of Matt Damon, Jean de Carouge. And of course, in the hands of the writers, Damon and Affleck, and the director Ridley Scott, this has become a movie that is really about
Checking my dog. It's weird that she's being awfully
politics
quiet.
and
She must
American
have done
gender
something fucked up.
politics in the 21st century. It's just put into it just happens to be taking place in the 14th century. Now, the costume in that movie is the 14th century, so they're not all wandering about in skinny jeans with iPhones. I'll grant you that. We don't do that. But what is obvious throughout that entire movie is that this is one big analogy for the modern world. So we're doing exactly the same thing in the 21st century as was being done in the 14th century, and we're aware that we're doing it. Now, the big question is, to what extent in the 14th century are they aware that this is a sort of fabricated vision of life, or that maybe it wasn't quite like this under Charlemagne? This is only really speculation, but I think that we must credit our historical forebears with some intelligence and self-awareness. I think we often write self-awareness out. We don't credit self-awareness in historical figures enough. I think people realise that this is not maybe quite how it was, but this is also the best way to make this story recognisable to a modern audience. And so the attitudes between then and now, I don't think are that radically different, just the technologies are.
I think that's a great answer. And I think I should have made a distinction between the highly educated members of society and those who'd never had any education at all, and that you were just pointing out may not even know about these events. So you have to make them relatable. So let's talk about, because when I was a kid and I was so interested in European history, you tend to forget all of the outward pressures of the other civilizations that are impacting that history. And you mentioned the Saracens and the Song of Roland situation. So let's talk about that for a minute. One of the more interesting and little known, I would think, and something that we should study more here in the West, is the great original Muslim conquests of the Arab and Byzantine and the other worlds. Can we talk a little bit about this? And can you, because I was trying to figure out if there was anything I could think of, historically speaking, from any era that was an analogy that made sense to that. That to me seems a singular, when you start looking at all the different angles, a sort of a singular event. Talk to me a little bit about the original Arab Muslim conquest, when Islam first appeared on the stage and rolled over several traditional superpowers.
It's one of the most extraordinary episodes in the whole of the Middle Ages. I mean, arguably,
I would say anything, anytime. Yes, anytime.
I think maybe, so the speed of conquest, and this is something you've obviously worked a lot on, is comparable with Genghis Khan's conquests. That scale, that speed, that rapidity of a sort of a new movement. But what's different between the early Islamic conquests, out of Arabia, through half of Byzantium, through the whole of North Africa, into Sicily, into Spain, all the way up to the Pyrenees, in no time at all.
The edges of China. Think about that. I mean,
the edges of China. Right, and leaving an imprint in all of those places, from Transylvania to the Iberian Peninsula, half the known world, that is in almost everywhere, that the first Arab caliphs after Muhammad, the rightly guided Russian caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali, through to the, all the way to, say, 750, the splitting point between the Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid. Almost everywhere that was conquered by the Arabs, by the Muslim Arabs, in those first generations of Islamic expansion, remains Islamic today. That imprint has lasted as long as all of the imprints the Middle Ages left in terms of, in the Western Christian world, the rule of law, the cathedrals, the castles that are all over, Western Europe and England and Wales in particular, the music, the art, the element of the political thought, just as much in the Arabic and Persian worlds, the first Islamic conquests had left their mark. However, there is a schism that exists in scholarship between Christian, Western, Anglophone, as well as French and German scholarship, and Islamic scholarship. And there are very few writers. You mentioned earlier on a book about the Crusades from the Islamic perspective, and I'm gonna place a small bet that you're thinking about Paul Cobb, his book on the Crusades through Arab eyes.
Yeah.
I think it's that book. Fantastic book, but a very, very rare book. Almost nobody on either side is doing that, and because so we still have this enormous historical schism. When I wrote the chapter in Powers and Thrones entitled Arabs, which narrates the story from Muhammad's life all the way up to 750 and the sort of the end of the expansion, I went into a totally new scholarship, and I had to talk to completely new scholars. I called up my friend Samira Heath, who's a brilliant, I've known for more than half my life, brilliant journalist. He's also a fantastic scholar on early Islam. And I said, Samir, you know what? I'm going to need a reading list here. And he sent me a long reading list, which I dug straight into. But there was no crossover with anything else that I was reading. Yeah, this was a scholarship that sat on its own, away from, the rest of what I was reading for this history of the Middle Ages. And so we don't tend to think about the early Islamic caliphates as being part of quote unquote medieval history, and yet they were. Now, Chris Wickham, brilliant scholar of the early Middle Ages, wrote an amazing book called The Inheritance of Rome, and it asked the question: after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, what comes into that space? And Wickham looks at the barbarian kingdoms. He looks at Byzantium, East around Constantinople. He looks at the Franks, and he looks at. So he's one of the Jewish scholars who looks at the Islamic Caliphate. Now, when I think about that, the big question: who has the best claim out of those groups to really call themselves the heirs of Rome? I would argue it's probably the early Islamic caliphs, because they put together the biggest empire on Rome's patch, bonded by a single language, Arabic, as Rome had Latin, bonded by something approaching a common bureaucratic imperial culture that's all the way from Transoxania to Spain. There is this sort of common feeling, bonded by coinage, bonded by faith above everything, capable, militarily fearsome, all of these. Arguably, it's the Arabs who are the real heirs of Rome. But I can almost feel people bristling as they hear that, because we just don't connect these two things as being part of the same historical story.
Well, and maybe forget that, I mean, again, if we're looking at this from a geopolitical standpoint, you put a map down from this era, you're going to see, I mean, this is how American military planners would look at it, right? They would say, well, look, you're surrounded over here in Spain, which is Moorish, North Africa's all Islamic, the Middle East is Islamic, the Byzantines are under siege, and in the north, you have non-Christian people, and this would have been where Christianity was considered almost a power block, the way we saw, communism and the free world as power blocks. So it's not your power block in the north, it's not your power block in Spain, it's not your power block in North Africa. And then if you're looking at this from a European point of view, you also have, and I love these cultures, you also have what you could call sort of what would you refer to? You call it the Berlin Wall of Europe, but it's what happens once you get to the plains of Hungary and the more flat territory that becomes the Great Steppe. And you've always had, and Herodotus is talking about Cimmerians and Scythians, and the Romans would use those same terms for much later peoples, but you have, we mentioned the Huns earlier, you've got an area there that just not only keeps the Europeans from expanding in that direction, but is continually pressuring towards the European direction, and it's one peoples after another, from Magyars and Huns and Avars and Seljuks, and talk to me a little bit about this great wall on the eastern side of European culture that is the steppe people, who also, of course, the other side of them is touching Chinese civilization. They're acting as a conduit between the two worlds that are not only not connected, but in a lot of cases don't even know of each other's existence.
Right, and maybe the analogy is the way we sometimes talk about bodies of water being either...
That's a good one, very good, yeah.
Roads or walls, right? On a time scale, it's the English Channel is either a barrier or it's a bridge. And the same is probably true of the Great Steppe that conjoins Eastern Europe with Northern China. Now, I think you're absolutely right. For the most part, that sort of keeps these big power blocks, these different peoples apart. However, when you come to suddenly the Mongols appear in the 12th century, it becomes like a super highway, and for the right military superpower, as the Mongols turn out to be, that's a road. That's a super highway to charge along. I think if we're thinking about those big blocks that emerge in the Middle Ages, and to connect this a little bit with the role of Islam and the Arab-speaking and Persian world, it's interesting. After the 8th century, roughly, those blocks don't really move very much, and it's only in there's an expansion of the Western Christian world in Spain and Portugal. Something interesting happens. The Reconquista is very, very unusual. Unlike the Crusades to Egypt, unlike the Crusades to the Middle East, to the Near East, Eastern Mediterranean. There's a permanent change in the sort of faith groups which govern that territory. We can look at Northern Europe, the Baltic, Scandinavia. That too, there's a Christianizing process there, a Christianizing process in Poland and Hungary and so on. But it does that remains the block. Well, Europe doesn't. It's not like the Crusaders going off that step, marauding their way all the way to modern Beijing.
On the road.
It's for the most part. I think you're right. I think that Great Step Line is a barrier. It's not. It doesn't become a conduit west to east. It's only ever really east to west.
One of the really interesting periods of history, I think, is the one where, it's analogous, I think, to the American so-called conquest of the Old West, when the Russians begin to push, from the 16th century, 17th century, they push east, going after the various steppe tribes in that direction, and the Chinese simultaneously are pushing west. And it's only with the change in technology or whatever that they're able to master this weapon system that has dominated that area and kept those powers out for millennia. Let me shift a little bit, because I got another interesting people I really want your take on, because I've never known how to classify them. They put them into the proper sort of place. How do we classify Norman? I mean, to me, this is one of the great. I mean, for those who don't know, we have this group of people, and I'll let Dan explain the background or the fusion that's always been, blamed for creating these people. But they arrive on the world stage. I mean, this is a giant play, right? Human history is a giant play. You have certain characters, we have American soap operas here in the United States that have been on TV for like 50 years. So we have this giant play, and there are certain characters that are always there. There's always the Chinese. There's always, the Persians. But then there are these characters that come in and are really important to the story for a short period of time and then just sort of disappear. Talk to me a little bit about the Normans in that kind of context.
Well, first we've got to think about what the word actually means.
Yes, don't we? Yes.
It's connected with Northmen. And the reason it's connected with that is because the Normans, you use the word fusion, I think that's exactly the right one. The Normans are people who are created in a sort of a process like nuclear fusion between the Franks and the Vikings. So the Franks under Charlemagne, around the turn of the 8th into 9th centuries, had begun expanding from a state that bridged modern France and Germany. It's the original European Union. France, Germany, Luxembourg, Austria, Northern Italy. It's like the 1950s version of the United, economically united Europe. That's the core of the current Frankish world. And then there is this dual processes of expansion in the Frankish world. South over the Pyrenees into Muslim Iberia, and then north into the pagan lands of Saxony and up towards what becomes a Danish march, a sort of a liminal zone between the Christian Frankish people of the Frankish world, the Caroline Frankish world, and the Vikings, the Scandinavian pagan people of the north. Now, over time, those people start to come into more and more regular contact with one another. And I'm quite persuaded by the line of thought that says the reason you start to see Viking raids the reason the Vikings set up at Lindisfarne and the mouths of rivers all down northern France at the end of the 8th century is because the Franks are starting to make themselves known, make themselves known as a wealthy people who would like to build monasteries, undefended, wealthy places that are easy to raid. So, anyway, the bigger point is little Vikings, Franks and the Vikings coming to so that by the end of the 9th century, there's constant Viking raiding into the Frankish world, and a succession of Frankish kings have to sort of scratch their heads and wonder what on earth they're going to do. This is sort of settled eventually with the creation of Normandy, with the award of land around the river state and the city of, the important city was now Rome. This is settled upon a bunch of monkeys, and the appeasement of the monkeys by giving them a proportion of the Frankish state in which to live. Now, their accommodation with the Frankish world, most notably the version of Christianity. By the time we get to the middle of the 11th century, you have a sort of quite unique people that produce, famously, William the Conqueror, the bastard of Normandy who invades England, or Robert Guiscard and Count Roger of Sicily, southern Italy and Sicily, and scourges of Byzantium and popes all at the same time. But really, what are these Normans? They are a hybrid of Franks, Christians, and quite small like Romans, and Vikings, out and out traveller, robber, pillager, trader, and yes, a trader, of course, mustn't be fair. They pillaged on traders, that's right, that's the news. So but they're an extraordinary people. I'm here in England, where I'm sitting right now, one of those turning points of history. It's one of the biggest states in the whole of English history. Better known even than our loss of the American colonies. We're still much more hung up on the invasion by William and Normandy than we are by
Everyone's sealed too fast. There's a grand family.
So, the Normans get around, and it's not just England, because as I've just mentioned, it's also southern Italy. I think the arrival of the Normans in southern Italy, the Norman conquest of Arab Sicily, is shudderingly important historical moment, because it becomes those Northern territories in southern Italy become pivotal to the Crusades. And I think the Crusades, 30 years on from the Norman conquest, the First Crusade, that's something that everybody, the whole Western European world thinks about. 1066 is not in that order of magnitude at all. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 to establish, yes, the Franks, but driven by the Normans, Beaumont and crew at the heart of it. I think the creation of the expansion of Normans into other parts of Europe, that's a really central part of the story of the High Courage.
There are some interesting historical ironies. It's funny, you want to mention these historical ironies, but then you catch yourself and say, okay, is this a real historical irony, or is this something that just appears that way, looking back from our modern eyes? And for example, here you have these Frankish people that are continually tying themselves to ancient Roman sort of behavior. The Franks themselves come into possession of the territories they're in because of Roman policies that brought barbarian people in and made deals with them, right? You defend this territory for the emperor and you can have it. Well, now you have the Franks, who are hundreds of years later essentially adopting the same policy with these Viking peoples. You can have a little of our Frankish territory, which was originally given us by the Romans so we can defend it, so you can defend it, and they just did what the Franks did too, and ended up creating their own empire based in Normandy. But it's interesting because it's not like the other empires. If you think about like a Frankish empire and what's now modern day France, morphing into France. If you think about what's become the Holy Roman Empire morphing into Germany, but the Normans are more like a free agent people, if you will. Like the first question someone should have when you say the Normans in Sicily is you go, wait a minute, how did the Normans find themselves in Sicily? And are these Norman soldiers, or are these... So in other words, trying to figure out and relate them to themselves. I was trying to figure out what the proper word for Normans is. Do you call Normans a tribe? do you call them a family? Are they like proto-Habsburgs that go around everywhere and rule multiple? You had mentioned at one point that you have Normans who are up at the wall between the Scottish and English borders at Hadrian's Wall. At the same time that they're all the way down in Sicily, they're who are these guys, and who makes up the soldiery? I mean, is there a Norman ethnic group? How does one put them in the normal boxes we're used to working?
You know, I think it's interesting. I think part of it, so I'd be interested to know what you think about this. Isn't part of it just the fact that by accident,
trilogy, the Godfather or Exorcist or Jaws. Let's talk a little bit about that and maybe give us an idea, because these people just play doesn't disease is terrible and regular occurrence. But how does something like that stand out in an era where they're accustomed to pandemics or terrible disease outbreaks?
Just in the play, in 6th century London, the great Byzantine emperor Justin is great, same as London, and insofar as we can tell, because the evidence is much scantier, just the FDA, and is also it seems to be similarly to what happened in the 14th century Black Death, which is it mutates to multiple infections. It's just as COVID-19 is a coronavirus, one of the viruses that became incredibly virulent and incredibly infectious. So you sometimes think of like just mutates super infection. And that's what we have in the 6th century, just in any way. And it seems to spread wrong. They one thing maybe that's not maybe from the standard, but it's very sure. And then it runs into the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. And you have these accounts of Byzantine hospitals, lockdowns, thousands of people dying each day, of bodies lying in the streets, of everybody being terrified of catching the disease, living, scarcely not living to bury the dead. There is disease factors like this environment, so Germany into Western Europe. There is massive disparity in estimates of how many people die from disconnect rate, which ranges from tens of millions to about 100,000, which is the accounts give us the impression that this was just the Black Death of the 14th century was what we do for 60% of populations were very strong. This was pretty appalling. Traditionally, you've been the historians have been on the journey to say, well, just it wasn't as bad as we thought. These accounts of pandemic disease do seem very important. But we've got the real eerie look at it. Some of these people back to the entry was quite happening. I found that so great that just definitely and like that during the pandemic. It's impossible not to have your perspective as a historian change.
Let me give the listeners an example of your writing. Just Peter Jones's book. Quote, John Augustus was sent off by the emperor to baptize pagans in Asia Minor, but he found himself traveling through a death zone. In town after town, the sick and suffering staggered through the streets, their bellies swollen and mouths hanging over, eyes bloodshot, pus leaking from their mouths, grand houses in which entire families and their servants had died, stood silent, every room occupied by corpses. Contorted bodies lay unburied, their midribs rotting and bursting in the heat of the day, the flesh half eaten by hungry dogs. The roads and highways were empty, the usual thrum of trade and traffic eroded. In desolate villages, no one was left to harvest crops and fruit trees. Animals were left unshepherded to roam the countryside. End quote. Jimmy, you just stop all of a sudden. It makes you feel like the pandemic you're living in now, when you become very grateful for modern medical technology.
You sure do. And let me tell you, all of that passage that you wrote there, I feel really presented as the your character is that's in a character. I mean, that's just my thing. So that this isn't something you wrote like that. This is what events or what now. And as I was saying, I was writing that, right? I think I wrote that in March, maybe April.
here. Oh, good.